Mr. State.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon. The next witness is Mr. Matthew Stile. Could he please be sworn?
If you could repeat after me, please. I do solemnly.
I do solemnly.
Sincerely and truly.
Sincerely and truly.
Declare and affirm.
Declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please. Thank you.
I hope you were warned we wouldn't get to this afternoon, Mr. Stile.
I was warned, my lady. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you please give the court your full name?
I can. My name is Matthew David Stile.
Thank you.
If I may, given that this is the first time I've appeared before the inquiry, just take a moment at the start to express my condolences to all of those who lost loved ones during the pandemic and all of those who were affected and endured hardships in other ways during the pandemic. And just to add that during the period that we're looking at today, I was a member of NHS staff at that time, and I was particularly conscious of the pressure and the kind of profound sacrifice of many of my colleagues at the front line during that period. I was not employed at the front line myself, and I just wanted to mark that with your permission at the start, if I may.
Thank you very much indeed. You very helpfully provided the inquiry with a witness statement, the reference for which is INQ 000513708. It's in fact your fourth statement, and for the purposes of this module, the corporate statement for DHSC concerning oxygen and ventilation. Is that right?
That's correct, Counsel.
It's 39 pages long, and is it true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much. Just briefly by way of background, you first became a civil servant in 2001 and joined the senior civil service in 2008. Is that correct?
That is correct, Counsel.
You have been the Director General of the NHS Policy and Performance Group, now known as the Secondary Care and Integration Group, since you joined DHSC in November of 2021. Is that right?
That's also correct.
You've just given us an insight that you were not, in fact, at DHSC for the majority of the pandemic. You tell us you were in the NHS.
That's correct.
But you do say that the Medical Technologies Directorate, about which Mr. Sterling gave some evidence earlier, did transfer to your responsibility in October of 2022 after the closure of the oxygen ventilation and devices programme we've been discussing. Is that right?
That's correct.
So well placed, I hope, to answer some of the questions that I've got for you, which in large part sit around, to some degree, that of Mr. Sterling's evidence, a bit about preparedness beforehand and a bit about looking to the future. Turning then to the preparedness and pre-pandemic ventilator capacity, you say in your witness statement at paragraph 30 that previous modelling had been undertaken that included estimating ventilator demand at various periods before the pandemic to improve DHSC's knowledge and understanding, including, for example, you say, consideration of recommendations about bringing ventilators that have been placed in storage back into use. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can we look at one of those, please? One of those, one of the documents that informs that, INQ 000514140. This is a document to which you very helpfully referred us, a report of the Swine Flu Critical Care Clinical Group and key learning points for future surge planning. If we could look at page 33 of that document, please. This is the section entitled Equipment Issues and looking at ventilators in particular. It says at paragraph 10, where plans include the following issues, then it's important that they've been tested and local actions identified. Firstly, using reserve ventilators, where ICUs are planning to use ventilators that have been kept in storage after being replaced, then there should be attention to ensuring that mothballed equipment has been recently serviced and that any specific equipment required for their reuse is available in sufficient numbers to enable repeated usage. As current staff may not be familiar with this equipment, there should be arrangements made to update training and also provision of appropriate paperwork instructions. Pausing there, you I don't know whether you heard Mr. Sterling's evidence. You're probably familiar with the content of it.
I am.
It touches there, doesn't it, upon some of what he was talking about. And again, looking at using equipment from outside ICUs, if introducing equipment and devices that are not normally used by existing critical care staff, there should be systems created to provide appropriate updated training sessions, and gives an example of including instructions in the use of anaesthetic machine ventilators. In your statement, Mr. Stile, you note that there an increase in capacity in terms of these types of devices was not required during the 2009 to 10 swine flu pandemic. Is that right?
That's correct.
Ventilator baseline capacities were therefore not further tested. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in fact, an increase in the baseline capacity was not considered necessary in a pandemic influenza scenario. Is that right?
Yes, I should add that, of course, I was not. This is implicit in the conversation in my evidence at the very start. I was not responsible for these issues at that time, so I am piecing together the history from going back and looking at documents that the department holds, as it were. But as you have set it out, as it is in my statement, yes, that's my understanding.
You've done so, if I may say, very helpfully. The fact that it wasn't considered necessary to increase the baseline capacity of ventilators, you say, was based on specific learning around how many ventilators were needed for events such as the 2009 swine flu pandemic. Is that your understanding of looking back across these documents?
That is my understanding, yes.
One other document to which you refer us is this one, please, INQ 40/57495. Somewhat plonked you in the middle here.
I'm familiar with it.
I hoped you would be. It's an NHS briefing entitled NHS Surge and Triage, a briefing to the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor from September of 2017, which considered ventilator capacity. And if we see at the very bottom of that page, under critical care surge, I wanted to see, if you can, please, to help us with some of these figures. The baseline NHS capacity for critical care at that time was said to be around 3,500 ventilated beds. Increased demand for critical care beds above this, nominally it says, by doubling capacity up to 7,000 ventilated beds, can be met through using areas within hospitals that are not usually used for long-term provision of such care, for example, theatre recovery areas or operating theatres. Just pausing there, you note in your statement, and we've already heard, that DHSC and NHS England, as you say, had a limited understanding about the number of ventilators available at that time. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Looking at this and the other document we looked at, you say that these previous studies regarding the impact of an influenza pandemic hadn't considered it necessary to increase, as we've discussed. And you say this: ventilator availability was therefore not identified early on as a priority, given the exercises that fed into pandemic planning. This, you say, was also the reason why data on ventilator availability was not available until the end of February 2020, as the department did not receive regular data on equipment stock levels from NHSE prior to the pandemic. Mr. Stile, we've heard from various witnesses now, Sir Gareth Rhys-Williams and Mr. Sterling. We're going to hear from another one this afternoon, Professor Moonesinghe, about the lack of available data as the pandemic hit in 2020 upon how many ventilators there were, where they were, the condition they were in, what model, what age, all the things that you might think become so crucial, in particular to clinicians. Looking at this and this use of the word nominally by doubling capacity, even back then in 2017, what has been done by the department looking forward to address this issue? An understanding of the baseline ventilator capacity, where it is, what state it's in.
Thank you. So I think I would draw out a I think I would draw out three things in respect of how the situation has changed since February 2020. But before I do that, if I may, because as I say, I've been back and looked in some detail at the documents that that are available and are on the records. And I think the overall picture, as you say, is the Hulf report from July 2010 talks about the need to be able to double critical care capacity, but there are no numbers specified within the Hulf report as to what levels that would, that would entail. The memo to which you refer, and which remains on the screen from September 2017, as you say, has the figures 3,500 and 7,000, and there are no recommendations in this memo for a baseline increase. That's the basis on which I make the statement I do in my statement. But to your question, the three things I think that are different. I hope I'm meeting the stenographer's needs. By the way, sorry. To your question of the three things that are different today compared to February 2020. The first is, I believe that Ramani, forgive me, sorry, Professor Moonesinghe, from whom you'll hear later, refers in her statement to an annual sort of survey and census of ventilator capacity that NHS England now carries out. Clearly, a lesson learned and implemented there. The second is that in the evidence given by Mr. Sterling to the inquiry earlier today, Mr. Sterling talked about the creation of the Medical Technologies Directorate in the Department of Health. And one of the activities that directorate has undertaken, working with NHS supply chain, is the establishment of a system called NETIS. I believe that stands for the National Equipment Tracking and Inventory System. But this is a system, an online system, that now enables us to track the quantity, make, model, and location of key bits of medical equipment across the NHS estate. And as I say, that system is in the process of being rolled out. It's already in use in some trusts, but not with full compliance as yet.
Just pausing there, is that wider than just ventilators and associated consumables? It's medical technology more generally?
It is wider than just ventilators and consumables. Yes, I couldn't give you, as I sit here now, the list of, I mean, Mr. Sterling in his evidence refers to the sheer scale of the medical technology sort of supply chain and industry, but it is a reasonably comprehensive system. So I think that that would be the second thing I would mention that I think would put us in a better place this time round to be able to understand the sort of starting point, and indeed to be able to tackle some of the issues that you referred to with Mr. Sterling around ensuring that as far as possible, where it was necessary to provide additional equipment that matched the experience and expectations and familiarity levels in existing organisations, because we'd know what they already had, as it were. So that would be the second thing that I think would lead to an improved position. And then the third is to say that, as my evidence makes clear, surplus ventilators were acquired during the pandemic, which has subsequently been distributed to NHS trusts. And we know, I believe, I may get the exact figure wrong, but approaching some 7,000 ventilators have been distributed to the NHS from the stockpile, and clearly we know where those have gone and the make and model of those ventilators, which I think speaks to another of the sort of lessons learned to which I refer in my statement, and to which indeed Mr. Sterling referred earlier, which is that balance between holding resilience centrally and holding resilience at the front line, so that process of ensuring that clinicians can be familiar with the equipment they're holding in reserve, can pay due attention to its maintenance and to the issues of interoperability and so on. So as I say, that resilience has been transferred from the stockpile out into NHS trusts.
Thank you very much indeed. Just before we turn off this document, can I ask you about one other aspect of it, please? If you can assist, given the context of the evidence that you've told us. Can you see halfway down the second paragraph that's on the screen now, the sentence beginning, a trigger point, the trigger point within surge plans for moving to the withdrawal of permanent ventilation will be when there is no more capacity and increasing numbers of patients who are likely to require it. This could be nominally set. Again, that use of the word nominally we've seen twice there. Just pausing there, would that be something less likely to feature now you've got a handle, as it were, on all the types, numbers, makes and models of ventilators across the system?
So I think I would say that I think we are better prepared in this respect now than we were in February 2020. I think beyond that, I'm here as a corporate witness today in respect of Module 5 and the procurement activities undertaken. I'm perhaps not the best witness to speak to the issues of pandemic preparedness in the round. I think that best falls to others. I would note that I believe that the September 2017 document was a draft document at that time. I have not seen in the evidence that has been available to me any further updates to this document or variants prepared since.
All right, we'll stop there in relation to that topic then, and I just want to turn briefly with you, if I may, to complete our understanding of the certain aspects of the procurement of ventilators. Briefly, please, on the numbers which were procured. This is your paragraph 51. We know that in March there were the tentative estimates of 6,000 to 8,000. You tell us that by the 9th of April there were 9,600 ventilators available. Yep.
Yes.
By the 14th of April, the department had procured a total of 10,993 mechanical and 19,338 non-invasive ventilators, although many hadn't arrived in the UK. We're talking significant numbers at significant speed here, aren't we?
Yes, and I think, and again, I think this came up in your evidence with Mr. Sterling earlier, and it's perhaps easier for me to say it as someone who wasn't involved in the programme at the time. I think once the programme was mobilised on the 3rd of March, the programme was very successful in mobilising incredibly quickly to expand supply by very significant volumes. The people involved at the time can be duly proud of their efforts in doing so.
Just to complete the picture, INQ, please, 000 494406, a slide that you provided within your evidence about these numbers. So we've gone through April, now we're at the 19th of May. This is a stock take of ventilators circulated on that date, the 19th. By now we can see that the total number of ventilators, including mechanical, NIV and CPAPs, is in the region of 34,800, comprising, as we see, 13,000 mechanical, a bit more than 11,000 bilateral or BiPAP ventilators, 10,100 CPAP ventilators, compared to a pre-pandemic stock of 4,954 ventilators. Can I ask you this question briefly? We can see the numbers that were achieved and we can see the speed in which they were achieved. Does the department agree with, do you, Mr. Style, agree with Mr. Sterling and Professor Moonesinghe about the variable quality at which, of which those ventilators were, given the speed?
I think that's it's clear from the evidence that there was indeed variable quality. That was clear from Mr. Sterling's statement earlier, and indeed in the documents I reviewed and have exhibited, against my statement, there was evidence of that very much from frontline colleagues at the time.
Thank you. One aspect of this procurement was that of ventilators from overseas. This is your paragraph 85. I want to show you one document, please. It was referred to in Mr. Waldcasey's opening. INQ 000 493 942. This is a document titled Ventilator Sifting Wash-Up Report by the Department for International Trade. It's dated the 24th of April 2020. And within here, there is a section reflecting upon the period at the end of March and the beginning of April. And what's said is this: there was huge international demand, greatly outstripping supply. Speculators, opportunistic intermediaries and individuals had piled in, trading up prices exponentially. Some of the units that we looked at had changed ownership over 5 times in the past 2 weeks. The prices quoted were on average triple the usual retail price, and at the peak of the market, many times over. And then this phrase, which I think is quite vivid: we had entered a ventilator procurement Wild West. Now, appreciating that wasn't part of your remit at the time, is that looking now at the procurement of ventilators from overseas, is that a picture that you recognised, having looked back across the documents?
I think it's undoubtedly the case, and again, I think that was clear from Mr. Sterling's evidence and from the exhibits attached to my statement, that it was an incredibly challenging commercial environment, both domestically and internationally, colleagues both in the Department of Health and Social Care, from the government commercial function more broadly, and indeed from the then Foreign and Commonwealth Office, worked together and went to kind of great lengths in order to secure supply and sort of protect the taxpayer in what was a very challenging commercial environment. I wouldn't comment on the language used by the author of this particular report.
Fair enough. But you say at your paragraph 85, just in terms of how this process happened, officials from the department indicated they'd be asking the Treasury for delegated authority to order ventilators, and that included on condition that there was an assessment of international suppliers in writing from both the FCO, as you said, and DHSC, to show that they were satisfied with the level of any risk of that purchase. Is that right?
That's right. So teams work together very closely, both to receive offers and sort of expressions of supply, make sure those were acted on swiftly. UK-based teams worked with FCO colleagues both to obtain documentation as to the sort of clinical specification and sort of compliance with standards of any offers, to try and extract information as to the location of devices, where they were being held, and so on. And indeed, as I think the exhibit you just put on screen makes clear, often you were dealing with resellers rather than manufacturers, indeed possibly multiple resellers. And again, FCO colleagues were instrumental in trying to get to the bottom of that thread, as it were, and help to inform judgments being made about the kind of credibility of those offers. And again, as someone who wasn't involved in the programme at the time, in going back and reviewing the evidence, and again, you can see this in my exhibits, what is striking is the speed with which colleagues were having to make judgments and liaise between, for example, Mr. Sterling, who appeared before the inquiry earlier today, his accounting officer and finance colleagues in the department, Treasury colleagues, FCO colleagues, both in London and in country, to sort of pool information and make those judgments very quickly as prices were escalating, mid-deal. Some of these examples I referred to in my statement, as you know.
Can we look briefly at one of those examples, please? Your paragraph 91. Just talk us through this, if you would, please. This was at the end of March 2020. You were made aware of an offer from a company in Malta. The number of ventilators doesn't matter, but just talk us through this example, if you would, and then ask you some questions about what it might tell us.
Sure. So on the 26th of March 2020, the FCO made the department aware of an offer from a company in Malta. I was about to say its name, but I probably ought not to supply ventilators initially for fewer than is stated in my statement here, but the number available rose to 3,000. The number purported to be available rose to 3,000 in the first stages of those discussions. There was extensive contact with the company in Malta from the department, but also Stuart Gill, who at the time was the British High Commissioner in Malta, had contact both with the company and with the Foreign Minister in Malta in order to do due diligence and arrive at a view as to the reputability of the company, which appeared to sort of stack up in the first instance. It then became clear as the deal evolved, certain bits of information came to light. For example, that the stock was held in China and would be transferred to the UK from Shanghai using Qatar Airways. The original agreement was that a deposit would be paid of just short of 40 million euros. Once that had been paid, there was then two changes were then made to the deal on the table. One was to seek an increase in prices. I believe that was on the 1st of April that approach was made, and to require an immediate letter of credit. The department proceeded at the time, working with the government legal department and its bankers, NatWest, to prepare a letter of credit, but made clear that the usual requirements in terms of confirmation of a delivery schedule and the location of the items for inspection and so on would be needed. Those were not forthcoming, and on both the 4th of April, I believe, and the 10th of April, the department repeated its requirements to the supplier. Ultimately, given that there was no confirmation of delivery date and no confirmation of the other details requested, on the 16th of April, we informed the company that we wouldn't proceed with the deal and requested a refund of the deposit. A refund was ultimately obtained. As my statement makes clear at paragraph 93, we did sustain a loss on that deal as a result of exchange rate fluctuations. I believe the loss amounted to approximately £540,000, but it was
Yes.
that order.
So, if you don't mind me saying, really quite a significant loss. That's not a small amount of public money, is it?
It is not a small amount of public money. I think this is a good example of the very difficult judgments that the team were having to make in order to secure the best possible supply.
So, Wild West, not your phrase, but a very difficult purchasing and procurement environment from abroad. You've very helpfully talked us through one example and the loss that was sustained. Do you, looking now, does the department think that in advance of any future pandemic, it's the stockpile question, that there should be a stockpile of equipment like ventilators and associated hardware? Appreciating there's a balance there, and would that help to lessen the risk of situations such as this one arising?
The first thing I would say is I believe we are in a more resilient position today than we were in February 2020, not least because there is increased resilience held, at the locally, as it were, as opposed to in a national stockpile. And clearly, if we didn't have such a significant need to procure additional ventilators in the sort of commercial environment that we've rehearsed, then we would be sort of less exposed to potential sort of losses and exploitation in that environment. But there is, of course, a balance to be struck, and I think Mr. Sterling, in his evidence this morning, referred to the sort of cost of storage if you hold a national stockpile. So in a sense, it's not a sort of, this is not a one-way balance, as it were. And also the risks of, the difficulty of maintaining equipment, ensuring that the equipment, keeps pace with, changes in clinical preference and indeed technological change as to the most effective equipment to hold. And indeed, and again, you'll have heard the inquiry, and perhaps even you, Council, will have heard other evidence from colleagues in the department about you don't know specifically which equipment you're going to need, depending on which pandemic is going to hit you. And it's particularly striking in this case, I think, and again, this is rehearsed extensively in the technical report, which is an exhibit to my evidence, and indeed Mr. Sterling referred to it earlier today. The clinical model of care evolved significantly throughout the pandemic. At the start of the pandemic, the focus was very much, and indeed the procurement focus of the programme was very much on mechanical ventilation. Towards the end or even in after the very first phases of the pandemic, the emphasis, clinical practice, and again, the technical report rehearses this, clinical practice switched towards non-invasive ventilation. So we could have had a sort of, huge stockpile of mechanical ventilators, and we may not have had, as many CPAP machines as we eventually decided that we need. So I think it is very difficult to foresee every single requirement for every single sort of potential pandemic and hold those centrally in a kind of physical stockpile. These are very difficult judgments. I think, one of the lessons of the pandemic is that those judgments need to be subjected to, very careful scrutiny and to be made and subject to very regular review, as it were. And I think that's sort of critically important, because there's no easy answer to this question.
Thank you very much. Turning briefly, please, to one other aspect of your statement, and that's about attempts to mitigate fraudulent behaviour in the procurement of this equipment. One of the documents to which your statement refers is INQ 000514235. Just going to talk through it very briefly, please. This is a letter from David Williams, Second Permanent Secretary at the DHSC, to the Public Accounts Committee in October of 2020, and a response to a request to write to that committee setting out instances of fraud when attempting to procure ventilators. Just a couple of points that are made. Can you see in this part here on the screen, the last section, often it was difficult to differentiate between over-optimism in complex supply chains and deliberate fraud. The due diligence process undertaken to test the proposed was designed to protect both against over-optimism and fraud. This is effectively suppliers claiming to have stock that they didn't. Is that right? That's what's being aimed at here.
I believe so, yes. And this is the letter to the PAC from David Williams, then I think Second Permanent Secretary at the time, to the PAC. Yes, that's my understanding.
The next section, under fraudulent documentation, we can see that in order to assess validity of suppliers, the department requested documentation from potential suppliers, including CE certificates and other things.
Yes.
You say whilst there were some of these documents could be independently verified, others were more challenging. And then there were a very small number of cases where clearly fraudulent documents were supplied and these were not taken forward. Mr. Starr, for obvious reasons, I don't want to get into the specifics of any particular case, but I wanted to get the department's view on overall, to what extent was fraud something that impacted upon the procurement effort of this type of medical equipment?
Well, look, we clearly fraud on any scale is something of very significant concern, and I take my responsibilities, as would David Williams as the accounting officer responsible at the time, taking our responsibilities for safeguarding taxpayers' investment very seriously indeed. Overall, I think this particular procurement programme was less vulnerable to fraud than some others may have been in these circumstances, simply because it was sort of easier to detect possibly some sort of clearly fraudulent or clearly over-optimistic offers, as it were. If people were suggesting that they could suddenly supply 3 times the typical annual output of a manufacturing facility of a ventilator, then it clearly didn't withstand scrutiny, as it were. As others have rehearsed in the evidence, ventilators are complex pieces of sort of clinical engineering, and you've got to have a certain degree of kind of established capability in order to be a credible supplier. And I think that helped to limit the programme's exposure to fraud overall. And as the letter to the PAC says, there was only one sophisticated suspected case of fraud identified. But as I say, I think that's in some ways that's a testament to the efforts of staff in London, in country, and so on, to perform as much due diligence as they sort of possibly could. I won't go over the details of that. I rehearsed it a little bit earlier on, and I think it was those teams working together that helped to minimise these risks of fraud very successfully during the programme.
Thank you. Just one question now, please, and I'm sorry to have moved you around sort of in short time between a whole series of topics, but you've been very helpful in your answers, if I may say. It's a topic upon which your witness statement and the evidence of Mr. Sterling this morning touches. It's that of clinician choice, and it's something you touch upon in your paragraph 155. First, there's this acknowledgement, which I'm just going to read to you. Given clinicians can have strong preferences for particular equipment, models and brands, greater account could perhaps have been taken of these preferences in determining the appropriate balance between stimulating the production of existing designs and developing novel designs. So you explicitly acknowledge that. But looking forward, talking about interchangeability and interoperability, what's the up-to-date position as far as the department's concerned?
Thank you. I think the first thing I'd say is I think my colleagues working on these issues at the time were right to pursue all of the available options. The scale of the demand projections, and again, I believe Mr. Sterling rehearsed this with you earlier, the scale of the demand projections was such that I think colleagues in the programme and their colleagues in the Cabinet Office working on the parallel programme were right to pursue all options. That was, as I said, it was the right thing to do. I do think it is very important to bear in mind the issues of familiarity with machines, interoperability, and so on. I think the key thing I would point to there is the sort of inventory and tracking system I referred to earlier. So we would be starting, were we to find ourselves in this position again, we'd be starting with a better understanding of which devices, of which make and model were in use in which organisations, as it were, and therefore we would be better able to ensure that we were sort of matching clinical preference and so on. But I think the other thing I would say is the importance of these issues, the importance of these issues of interoperability and familiarity with a range of devices. The pandemic experience has absolutely shone a light on that, and I think those clinical teams at the front line in thinking about their own resilience will clearly be much more mindful of those issues, based on those lessons than they kind of may have been previously.
Thank you very much. Lady, those are my questions. There are some more.
Thank you very much. Spanton, I think you've got some questions. Over that way.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lady. Just for some context, Mr. Stahl, I represent FEMHO, and in your capacity overseeing critical aspects of pandemic response, particularly related to ventilators and oxygen therapy devices, it's crucial to explore how considerations of equality impacted decision-making processes. FEMHO would like to understand the extent to which the needs of Black, Asian and minority ethnic healthcare workers were considered in procurement and policy formulation, helping to shape recommendations for improving resilience and equity in future health crises. So my first question is in relation to paragraphs 40 and 61 of your witness statement, where you describe the processes and shifts in strategy regarding the allocation and management of ventilators and oxygen therapy devices. How did the National Ventilator Allocation Panel ensure compliance with the public sector equality duty when making allocation decisions?
Thank you. I think it's obviously a very important issue, and one of those on which the pandemic has, shone a particular light on the need to consider the differential impact that different health emergencies will have on populations. I think two things are important in response to your question. The first is that the decisions that the programme through the National Ventilator Allocation Panel were making were first and foremost informed by the clinically led projections. So, as you will know, as you will understand much better than me, that understanding about the differential impacts of the virus on different sections of the population, including the particular impacts on people from ethnic minorities, as well as other factors such as age and sort of geographical factors and so on. That understanding evolved over the pandemic, but as that evolved, that increasing understanding was then being fed into the clinical work that was being done to make projections of future demand and so on, and those projections of future demand were then fed into the allocation panel in order to make its decisions. Similarly, and again, as Mr. Sterling said earlier today, the key inputs into the allocation process came from regional medical directors and their teams who I was not part of the process at the time, but I have worked extensively with regional medical directors over the years, and I think that they, were sort of well placed to have that sort of very up-to-date connection with the differential pressures and the very localized impacts on particular communities, and therefore on particular hospital trusts and healthcare providers that wouldn't necessarily have been picked up in sort of aggregate data, but the medical director would have known that particular pressures were being experienced in that institution because of the demographics of its sort of local population. So I think those are the ways in which the factors you describe, and in particular the differential impact on people from ethnic minorities, would have been appropriately reflected in and been sort of had input into the decisions made by the National Ventilator Allocation Panel.
Right, okay. Thank you. I'll answer my next question. In the governance of the O2VMD and CC programme that you mentioned, various decision-making bodies and their roles, and this is at paragraph 60 and then 63 to 66. So in respect of that, I've got just 2 points to raise. The first one, how were representatives from ethnic minority-led healthcare providers included in these forums, if at all, to ensure their specific needs were addressed?
I'm afraid off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you whether or how specific representations from ethnic minority communities were reflected in the governance of the programme. I think the thing which if I may, one of the things I would draw attention to, and I referred earlier to the fact that this is something in which sort of learning and understanding has advanced significantly as a result of the pandemic experience. We have since established, as you will no doubt know, the NHS Race and Health Observatory under the leadership of my colleague, Professor Habib Naqvi. And that's now a very well-established channel for ensuring that policymakers, operational decision makers can access analysis, insight, and sort of representations to make sure that that's absolutely at the heart of decisions that are now, as they are now made across the system.
Right. So, was there any mechanism to gather input from healthcare providers serving predominantly ethnic minority communities to inform procurement strategies?
I think the principal vehicle for doing so would have been through both the clinical and operational representatives from NHS England. So, for example, Dr. Dame Emily Lawson as SRO for the programme, and Professor Sir Keith Willett as the National Director for Emergency Preparedness in NHS England were both represented in programme governance, and both Keith and Emily would have been in several times daily contact with frontline providers, and therefore had that very sort of swift intelligence as to differential impacts and particular providers struggling to meet the needs of particular communities. It would have been through those mechanisms that intelligence was available to the programme.
Right. And in considering my next question, considering the preparation for future health threats and lessons learned going forward, and not just only from the pandemic, as discussed in paragraphs 166 to 168 of your witness statement, the first point is, how does the government assess its effectiveness in protecting ethnic minority healthcare workers during the pandemic?
Well, as I said, if I may, as I said at the start of my evidence, I was a member of NHS staff at the time, and I was particularly conscious of the challenges faced by colleagues at the front line. And as you say, some people were more affected than others and experienced greater challenges. I think it's not something on which I'm not the appropriate witness to speak to this in detail, but what I would say, my understanding, is that colleagues in the various different sort of operational cells responding to the pandemic acted as swiftly as they could once the sort of data and intelligence began to show that some staff were experiencing greater challenges than others, and I saw again colleagues in NHS England at the time acting sort of swiftly to sort of very rapidly learn those lessons and change the way they were leading and managing staff, including to take account of the preferences of individual employees about their own deployment and so on through the pandemic, precisely to ensure that a full account could be taken of the sorts of differential impacts to which you refer.
And following on from that, what specific measures are being implemented to ensure better preparedness and protection for these workers in response to future health crises?
Forgive me, I mean, this is a critically important issue. It's not something that I am the best person to speak to as a corporate witness for the procurement module, as it were. But it's clearly a critically important issue.
Right. How would you say, how are the lessons learned being integrated into current and future policies to enhance the resilience and safety of the healthcare system, particularly for ethnic minority communities?
Well, I think I would go back to my overall assessment is that we now have in place a system that allows us to much better understand the resilience of all of our hospital trusts across the country. So we would, were we to find ourselves in a similar position again, we would start with a much better understanding of resilience. We also, as I said, not least through the work of the Race and Health Observatory, we have established mechanisms to ensure that we are thinking actively about differential impacts on different communities, including different communities within our staff. We're much more conscious of it. We have established mechanisms to ensure that that's reflected in our policy making and our operational decision making.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady. Those
Thank
are my
you,
questions.
Ms. Mountain. Very grateful. Mr. Stokes, I think that completes the questions for Mr. Stiles. Thank you very much indeed for your help. Mr. Stiles, very grateful to you.
Thank you.
Mr. Stokes, I'm in your hands. It's early for the break, but we're making very good progress.
Yes.
It's entirely up to you. You're calling the next witness, I think.
I am.
It's entirely up to you whether we get on to the next one or take the break now.
I can certainly make a start, my lady, if that would...
Okay.
Thank you. The next witness, please, is Professor Ramani Moonesinghe.
If you could repeat after me, please. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you, please. Thank you.
Professor, I don't think we've kept you waiting too long. I hope we haven't.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please could you give the court your full name?
Ramani Moonesinghe.
Thank you. You've very helpfully given the inquiry a statement, the reference for which is INQ 000518349. It's 54 pages long and dated the 28th of October of last year. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Professor, the inquiry has had some impressive CVs, but yours, if you don't mind, will take a little while to go through. You are a doctor who has worked in the NHS for some 27 years, including 20 working clinically in critical care. Is that right?
Correct. Thank you.
You were appointed a consultant in critical care, anaesthesia and perioperative care at UCLH in 2009,
Yes.
where you worked in a multidisciplinary team providing care for critically ill patients in one of the largest services in the UK.
Yes.
You're a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, the Royal College of Anaesthetists and the Faculty of Intensive Care Medicine, and a Senior Fellow of the Faculty of Medical Leadership and Management.
I am.
You were appointed as a National Specialty Advisor for Perioperative Care at NHS England in 2019.
Yes.
You started, you say, providing input on clinical and operational matters related to the COVID-19 response within NHS England on the 2nd of March of 2020.
Correct.
And you were formally appointed to the role of National Clinical Director for Critical and Perioperative Care at NHS England on the 19th of March of 2020 to provide national clinical leadership for adult critical care in the pandemic, and in fact, still now.
That is correct.
And are there any other positions you currently hold?
I am currently also the Interim National Director for Patient Safety for the NHS in England.
Thank you very much indeed. As the first clinician today, talking about some very complex pieces of kit, you may or may not wish to set us right, but when we're talking about the procurement of ventilators and associated kit, we're talking about a fairly complex range of specialist equipment, aren't we, for treating critically ill patients? Is that right?
That is correct.
Could you give us a brief but sort of overall flavour of how what is that stuff that's needed?
Thank you. So critical care treats patients who either have organ failure or are at risk of it. The organ failure that we most commonly associate with critical care is respiratory or lung failure, and the treatment for respiratory failure is either mechanical ventilation, where one places a breathing tube into a sedated patient, and then the mechanical ventilator either fully breathes for the patient or supports the patient's own breathing effort. The next step down from that is non-invasive ventilation, where a patient would use a tight-fitting face mask and air and oxygen would be blown into them through that. The next stage down from that is continuous positive airway pressure, or CPAP. Some people may be familiar with CPAP because we use it as a treatment for obstructive sleep apnea at home. So many people have CPAP machines at home. But in the hospital environment, and indeed during COVID, we also use it to treat respiratory failure, again through a tight-fitting face mask or sometimes a helmet or hood. Critical care also treats organ failure or risk of organ failure of all our other organs. So that includes our cardiovascular system, usually with drugs, but sometimes with mechanical devices, the kidneys, with renal replacement therapy, a type of dialysis, and so on and so forth. And obviously critical to all of that is the staff, because this is the absolute sharpest end, I suppose, of what we offer in terms of ward-level care in the hospital. And so the staff that work within critical care have been trained to use all of these machines, to understand the context of failing or failed organs, and provide that holistic care to the patient and also to their loved ones.
Thank you. And as well as the staff and the machines themselves, there is a wide range of other consumable items that go alongside that, aren't there?
That is correct. So capital equipment like monitors, so we can see the blood pressure and so on continuously. Consumable items, so I've already mentioned breathing tubes, but the drips in our hands and all sorts of other things, catheters and so on. So one of the things that we had to do at the beginning of the pandemic was actually to itemize everything that we might use in a critically ill patient, how much we would use, how many we would need per individual patient based on projections of how long we thought patients would be in hospital requiring that kind of help, and so on. It's a very, very complex task.
One of the tasks that we'll go on to discuss that you had was clinical leadership and the procurement of this stuff, wasn't it, that we've been discussing? As part of the preparation for this inquiry, you were provided with a statement by Professor Philip Banfield, Chair of the British Medical Association's UK Council.
Yes.
Perhaps we can bring it up. INQ 000 562 457 at page 85, at paragraph 274. I've got it on the screen for you there, I hope, Professor.
Yes.
The observation of the BMA here is this: the UK started out on the back foot in relation to the supply of intensive care ventilators, having failed to sufficiently consider ventilation capacity as part of pre-pandemic planning and preparedness. This is because recommendations set out in exercise Cygnus were largely overlooked, despite concerns around ICU ventilator capacity then. The failure to action the recommendations meant that at the pandemic's outset, the UK was already at serious risk of running out of ventilators, with all four governments noting a very significant shortage of ventilators compared to estimated potential need. Indeed, the UK entered the pandemic without enough ventilators and ICU beds for normal levels of emergency and elective care. The lack of a staffed ICU bed was and remains a frustratingly common reason for the cancellation of major surgical procedures. Speaking from your position, do you agree with all part of that picture presented here?
So I can't comment on the recommendations from Exercise Sickness because I have not seen that.
Okay.
However, there's no doubt that the NHS in England and I think across the UK has lower critical care capacity on a day-to-day basis than comparable countries, so OECD countries. And this has been noted previously, my lady, in Module 3 by Professor Sir Chris Whitty and also by the expert witnesses for intensive care. So we went into the pandemic with approximately 6 beds per 100,000 population in England. And today, having increased our intensive care capacity as a result of COVID, and since then, some investment being made, we're at about 7. But many other countries are at nearer 10 or 11. And we can perhaps talk about that more later.
Yes. You came in, you started providing, as you've already told us, clinical input on operational matters on the 2nd of March, took up your formal role as National Clinical Care Director on the 19th. I want to ask you about the picture as it presented to you. There was, as we've heard from others, really quite a stark lack of data about the availability of all the kit that we've just discussed. Was that, do you share that assessment?
So a stocktake was undertaken towards the end of February, which gave us an understanding of the number of critical care beds and ventilators in the system, and also the number of anaesthetic machines, which were the secondary source of ventilatory equipment, not ideal, but a reasonable next choice, and also gave us an understanding of the number of transport ventilators, which are, again, not an ideal choice for ventilating critically ill patients, but a means of doing so. So that was organised by our emergency preparedness response and EPRR team at the end of February, and that gave us the numbers, which were, from memory, in the order of around 7,000 ventilators. I may have got that slightly wrong, of which about half were true critical care ventilators and the rest were second choice equipment.
The witness statement to the inquiry of Dame Emily Lawson, Chief Commercial Officer of NHS England during the pandemic, as I'm quite sure you know, says as follows. I don't think I need to bring it up. Can I just put this point to you? It's her paragraph 99. She says, of exactly this time, one of the initial problems I encountered after joining the team, this is Mr. Sterling's team, was that there was no recent indication of the number of existing ventilators, their make capabilities available to the NHS. This information was needed to inform purchasing. And then this, a ventilator survey had been conducted in 2017, needed updating. I had no concerns about this. Ventilator numbers are not data that I would have expected us to routinely collect and hold nationally. Did you have any concerns about the fact that there hadn't been a survey since 2017, the lack of data? Was it concerning to you?
I suppose by the time I got involved, we already had the numbers. So I think it's surprising, perhaps, that we did not have more up-to-date information than 2017. It is something that we have learned from, and the NHS and NHS England has conducted a survey 3 times, so annually, since COVID, to understand the number of intensive care beds, the number of ventilators in intensive care units, and also our immediate surge capacity as well. So beds that could be stood up within 24 to 48 hours to support critically ill patients, should it be required outside a normal context.
In any event, you say it was clear, and I think that we've heard this now from a number of people, that there were insufficient numbers of ventilators to meet the demand.
That is correct. So when I was first involved in early March, one of the first jobs that I did was to support looking at lists of ventilators that we could potentially procure, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a moment. And our strategy collectively was to map every single thing that would be required to treat a critically ill patient and make sure that not one individual thing would be the rate-limiting step in being able to treat as many people as possible. So the reasonable worst case scenario data that I was presented with on around 15th of March 2020 indicated that we would need at least 30,000 intensive care ventilators and possibly many tens of thousands more than that. So starting with a baseline of 7,000, it was clear that we had a long way to go.
Yes. We'll come probably after the break to the ventilator challenge. We've heard a bit about that. That was designed, wasn't it, to fill that gap between supply and demand. But just before we get there, I wanted to ask you about this observation of yours. In parallel with the idea of manufacturing new ventilators through the challenge, you say this: an increasing number of innovation proposals were being received by NHS England, DHSC and professional bodies, necessitating the deployment of a systemic approach to evaluating other options, effectively. What were those other options that were being considered?
So it speaks to the ingenuity of my colleagues and the effort that everyone was trying to put in to meet the challenge, that some very unusual ideas came to the fore. For example, repurposing veterinary ventilators and anaesthetic machines for humans. That was reviewed by somebody from the Royal Veterinary College and dismissed. The idea of splitting a ventilator, which would always be used to treat a single person, between two people. Again, something that we considered and dismissed. And then the third idea was to try and make ventilators. And that, and multiple people were thinking in the same way. That is what eventually led on to the ventilator challenge.
As well as speaking to ingenuity, does it also speak, in your view, to a lack of preparedness?
100%.
Milady, that might be a convenient moment for you.
Certainly. I shall return at 8:15. I hope you were warned about our break.
Yes.
Depends on the witness. We do have perfect witnesses occasionally, which we did this morning. I shall return at 8:15.
All right.
Mr. Stoke.
Thank you, milady. Professor, before the break, we were just turning to the ventilator challenge. We've already heard in the inquiry quite a lot of evidence from Sir Gareth Rhys-Williams, with whom you work very closely in that endeavour.
Indeed.
So I only want to ask you about a couple of specific aspects of it. One of the initial things that you did as part of the ventilator challenge was to produce a draft of what you call the rapidly manufactured ventilator specification. What was that?
It was the minimum requirement for a ventilator to be made through the ventilator challenge. It didn't set a maximum requirement, but it was the minimum clinically acceptable requirement for a ventilator.
And what key features were you looking for in that requirement?
So if I may, I just want to provide a little bit of additional context. We've talked about how complex ventilators and that type of equipment are. And although as a clinician I know quite a lot about how a ventilator works, I don't know a great deal, and even to this day I don't know a great deal about how they're made. And they include complex parts, electronics, software, and so on. So because of the speed with which we were going to require machines to arrive into clinical practice, we had to moderate some of the clinical ambition about what these machines would be able to do, because otherwise we would set a specification that was unachievable and patients would die as a result of not having machines available to them. So the specification that we wrote gave the basic requirements of a machine that could keep a patient who needed it alive for a few days, potentially, until something better was available. So the basic requirements included a machine that would be able to support a patient who was fully sedated, unable to make any respiratory effort themselves, and an optional requirement for a machine that would be able to support the breathing of a patient who was making some respiratory effort. Now, we take both of those modes for granted in normal practice, but the second one of those is really quite complicated because the machine could potentially interfere with the patient's respiratory effort, and it would be a disaster. So we set the minimum requirement as just the machine would do all the breathing for the patient. Similarly, the amount of oxygen that we give patients, normally on any ventilator, we can dial up at any percentage between 21%, which is room air, and 100%. But that requires a degree of engineering, potentially software, that we considered would be unachievable in the timeframes that we were working to. So we set a minimum requirement of 40 to 50% oxygen or 90 to 100% oxygen. And that we felt was achievable and also as safe as it could be, and so on and so forth.
Yes, and I'm sure there were many others, and some of them were about, is this correct, trying to mitigate clinician unfamiliarity as well. Were they sort of trying to make something universal?
Something that would be easily adopted into practice, something very simple that would be fail-safe and potentially deployed with clinical staff that were unfamiliar with the critical care environment as well as with the machine.
You were asked to produce this, you say, within one working day on the 13th of March 2020.
That is correct.
Which, with some understatement, you say this was duly provided, so you did that very quickly. It was something you say you developed together with your husband, Mr. Pennington Ridge, Edward Pennington Ridge, is that right?
That is correct.
You say he's an independent design consultant who fulfilled the role of, quote, inventor in residence at UCLH and had extensive and relevant design experience.
That is correct. He is a designer that has specialised over the years in technology solutions for low resource settings, and that's pretty much the situation that we were in.
One of the statements we've received, as you're aware, is from Professor Tom Clutton-Brock, a name we've mentioned a few times, Director of the Medical Devices Testing and Evaluation Centre, with whom ultimately you would work quite closely again, wouldn't you, on testing the designs that you'd said yes and no to. Can we just turn that up, please? INQ 000 515 729. Can you see halfway through paragraph 4, Professor Clutton-Brock says, in 2020, other members of MedTech and the Trauma MIC, which is the Trauma Management MedTech Cooperative, did not have expertise in mechanical ventilation. They assisted with phone calls and deliveries, but did not take part in any ventilator testing or the challenge. To assist with administrative duties and to act in training videos, my two daughters, history undergraduates who'd come home from university, volunteered to come into MedTech each day with me. Now, on the one hand, you working with your husband, Professor Clutton-Brock pulling in his undergraduate daughters. Again, it's that spirit of ingenuity and resourcefulness in a crisis on the one hand, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But again, does this tell us the next clinical care director may not have a husband, or the next director of MedTech may not have willing daughters to come and help him in the crisis? What does this tell us? What lessons can we learn looking forward about this aspect?
My overarching lesson is that we went into the pandemic really unprepared in terms of the technology that we had available to us. We really unprepared to be able to scale up critical care capacity in the way that we had to, and woefully unprepared for what we thought might be our reasonable worst-case scenario. So in order to avoid the luck, or in order to not need the luck that we had through these sorts of, in these circumstances, it's all about planning and preparedness and spending a year or even 5 years doing what we had to do in a few days.
To some extent, a similar theme runs through your assembly of the Technical Design Authority. We've heard a little bit about that. This was a group of senior clinicians you assembled between within a very short space of time between the 15th and 18th of March, for which you provided clinical leadership, and which served, is this right, as the independent expert advisory panel to the Cabinet Office in the Ventilator Challenge?
That is correct, and some of them also assisted with the procurement effort of devices that were already CE marked and were being procured from overseas, as Mr. Sterling has described this morning.
You say this: no formal appointments process was undertaken due to the speed with which we needed to assemble that panel. It was you, was it, asking who you thought could help?
Yes, and there was a bit of rhyme and reason to it, in that I asked clinical colleagues who, first of all, I trusted and I knew would have the required expertise. I asked one colleague with a respiratory medicine background as well as intensive care, another colleague with an anaesthetics background as well as intensive care. We have slightly different training and so slightly different experience. Another anaesthetist intensivist who had been involved in procurement decisions in his own trust, which I thought would also be useful. And a senior, what we would call resident now, who was already working with NHS England in other matters, and also was able to provide a sort of hands-on, the residents are always there around the clock, so that perspective as well. And the other thing I had to take into consideration when asking these colleagues to help was their availability. So I did actually ask others, obviously people in my own hospital, as you would expect, but they were all too busy either delivering clinical service or planning for delivering clinical service to be able to give their time to this. So availability and expertise were the key considerations.
I'm going to take you forward to one of the reflections you have and the lessons learned. And it's your paragraph 200B. You say, in advance of any future emergency, a panel of experts, including engineers and clinicians, should be commissioned to develop the minimum acceptable specifications for a range of scenarios based on the demand and the time frame for manufacture, which you say would improve the feasibility and effectiveness of our response in a significant surge. And we'll come to the reasons in a minute. But would that avoid the need for husbands, daughters, no doubt qualified, but somewhat hastily assembled panels?
It would. And it would also give clinicians more trust in what was going to be delivered to them. There was a lot of anxiety. So there was a phrase that I heard early on which I was troubled by, which is that a bad ventilator is worse than no ventilator at all. Now, perhaps counterintuitively, even if you need mechanical ventilation because you're effectively suffocating because of your respiratory illness, ventilators can cause further damage to the lungs. If we put too much air and oxygen into you, you can cause what we call volutrauma. You inflate the lungs too much. If you apply too high a pressure, you can cause barotrauma, to pressure damage to the lungs. So in normal practice, we are all trained to apply just the right amount of volume and just the right amount of pressure to the patient in order to try and optimize their oxygen and carbon dioxide levels without causing further damage to the lungs. And we've done many randomized trials to find the right sweet spot. The problem is that in order to get that sweet spot, you need the most complex, the most sophisticated of intensive care ventilators. And we were not in a position to be able to make, and indeed even procure a lot of the time, ventilators of that sophistication. Therefore, we had to make some difficult choices to provide a pragmatic specification that would be achievable by industry and save some lives. And so that statement of a bad ventilator is worse than no ventilator at all was completely untrue in the context of the pandemic, because there would have been potentially, if the surge in demand had been as much as we had feared it would be, patients who would have simply been left to die without that support. So we had to make those choices.
Now, I'm not going to go into the detail of the evolution, but it's fair to say, isn't it, that the specification you provided developed quite significantly over time.
It did, and that is because the circumstances changed. So the specification that was initially published by the MHRA on the 18th of March, based off that initial one that my husband and I produced, was the most basic, anticipating that we would have to have product, as Sir Gareth mentioned, within 2 to 3 weeks. Now, what happened was two things. The first is that, thankfully, the catastrophic surge in demand that we anticipated did not happen. And that was largely, if not entirely, down to the non-pharmaceutical interventions, the lockdowns. So that bought us some time. And what that meant was that we could then afford to push for a slightly more sophisticated minimum specification, because the people that were developing the ventilators had more time to develop that degree of sophistication. And then the second thing that happened was that our understanding of COVID as a disease was improving, because we were actually treating patients in their many hundreds and thousands. And so we could identify the specific things that it would be particularly important to try and prioritize in a more sophisticated design. So one of those, as Sir Gareth mentioned a couple of weeks ago, was the ability to put a tube down the breathing tube and suck out the phlegm, essentially, because the patients were, they had a lot of what we call secretions on their chest. That's a nice to have on the context of the 18th of March, but it became an essential as we bought more time.
Now, one of your roles clinically was to provide what you call a go or no-go recommendation.
Yes.
So you're presumably testing offers of procurement from everywhere, overseas, the UK, and through the Ventilator Challenge, testing them against this specification, are you, and then deciding yes, procure, or no, don't procure? So
the procurement and the Ventilator Challenge required slightly different approaches. Right. In procurement, we were looking at devices that all had CE marks. And so they'd been through some sort of regulatory approvals process, perhaps not in the UK, but internationally. And my colleagues and I reviewed the publicly available materials, so the instructions for use from manufacturers and other materials from manufacturers' websites. And based off that information, categorised the ventilators into proper ITU intensive care ventilators versus anaesthetic machines versus transport ventilators in reducing levels of sophistication, and then provided that go, no-go based entirely on clinical grounds. Yes. To Chris Sterling and his team.
So your considerations were entirely clinical, but from what you say, this is your paragraph 97, that information from manufacturers, you were entirely dependent on that, given the circumstances of the procurement?
Yes, if they were machines that were not already in use in the NHS.
Was the quality of that information provided by manufacturers variable?
As it turns out, it was variable.
You also say this, the clinical review could not involve putting the devices to actual use, as you had presumably to make such rapid procurement decisions in the context of high international demand and shortage.
That is correct. And going back over my records, you could see the pace with which everybody was working. The procurement team would send us huge spreadsheets and sets of documents to review, and then in the nicest possible way were pushing us very, very hard for decisions, because the market was so volatile that we had to collectively had to make those decisions quickly in order to not miss out on the opportunity to buy the machines.
We don't need to dwell on this in particular detail because we've heard evidence, but did you hear some of the evidence of Mr. Sterling this morning?
I did.
Including about the Shangri-La model, the 510S.
I did.
You will have heard then, I suspect, the consternation that caused at the particular trust to which it was delivered.
Yes.
You, in fact, received, didn't you, correspondence from that trust directly to you?
I did.
With those concerns?
At my request.
At your request, right. So if we look very briefly, please, INQ 000 508296. This is a letter from Dr. John, I don't know how to pronounce it actually, Hume?
Hume, I think, yes.
Hume, yeah, thank you. Dated the 13th of April 2020, just the first couple of lines. Dear Ramani, feedback summary of this particular model of ventilator. We spoke to you today as part of a group of clinicians and senior managers with the Birmingham and Black Country region about our serious concerns that these models, these 250 Shangri-La 510 ventilators delivered to us are not fit for purpose within an intensive care setting. And then this, we believe that if used, significant patient harm, including death, is likely. So these were really significant concerns, weren't they?
They were. And I think this is an example of how our systems were actually, although this outcome was obviously not desirable, this is an example of how our systems were working well, in that this issue had been brought to my attention the previous day by a regional medical director for the Midlands region who had expressed it at one of the daily meetings that we had with medical directors that Mr. Sterling described this morning. I then requested a meeting with the clinicians so I could hear their concerns firsthand. Having heard them and taking them very seriously, I asked them to write this letter, which they did, summarising everything, and also summarising where their experience of using the machines differed from what the expectation should have been from the manufacturer's materials. So I subsequently, having received this letter, sent immediate notice to the procurement team and the team dealing with ventilator allocation to say, please don't allocate anymore, please don't buy anymore, and we need to do some more due diligence. I then, the next day, went to the next of these meetings and heard from colleagues in the southeast, from Portsmouth, where they had also received one of these machines. And we basically collated through this and from Portsmouth the evidence that we needed to confirm that we should not be trying to deploy these machines into clinical practice. And we then sent one of these machines to MD Tech, to Birmingham, to do bench testing, which then eventually led to our final conclusion that we should not deploy these machines.
Part of the statement of the BMA suggests that there was a rushed procurement process. First of all, do you agree with that characterisation?
Rushed feels pejorative. We worked at pace.
Do you think it was a device like this where you hadn't been able to undertake the due diligence was a consequence of that pace then?
If we had years, so if I was to support my colleagues at my hospital in buying a new intensive care ventilator today, that process would take months. My colleague in charge of procurement would seek the best models, the manufacturers, they would come to the hospital, they would give us one to play with, or a few, and then the team would make a collective decision. There was clearly no time for any of that. So, again, preparedness is one thing that might have assisted in this. But, again, for further context, the programme that Mr. Sterling was in charge of, by the middle of 2021, had deployed more than 45,000 capital pieces of equipment into the NHS, of which about 11,000 were mechanical ventilators, non-invasive ventilation machines, CPAP machines, and so on. And others were things like analyzers for blood at the bedside and so on. To my knowledge, this is the only procurement that failed in this way. So I think given that context, yes, we worked at pace, but it was to meet a need that actually was largely met.
Final aspect of questions on this particular model. If we look, please, at INQ 000 514240, This is the MedTech report on this particular model, and it's just these concluding paragraphs. So this is by Professor Clutton-Brock, who says the extraordinary circumstances facing the NHS and many other healthcare systems in March 2020 made the usual process of device procurement, selection, medical engineering, training and assessment, clinical training and assessment, detailed procurement instructions, difficult, if not impossible, to follow. Referring to the particular model, the Shangri-La, he says, as a result, hose incompatibility, oxygen sensors, casing and breathing system choices were not properly identified. And I wanted to ask you about this next line. Even in pandemic times, rapid external review of new technology procured for the NHS should be undertaken to identify suitability and training needs. Do you have a view on that?
Yes, and so first of all, I agree entirely with Professor Clutton-Brock. And what he describes as the process that we evolved towards, that Mr. Sterling has described this morning, where we procured the technology based on written materials because there was no time to do anything else. But partly as a result of the Shangri-La episode, we set up the system that meant that in Donington, where the supplies were received, there was then a process that was undertaken with clinical due diligence and an engineering assessment and potentially bench testing either at MD Tech or in Nottingham to test these devices before they were deployed into the system. So we adapted our processes to get nearer to what Professor Clutton-Brock describes here, or to meet that request.
I want to turn to your reflections, please, and put three short parts of your witness statement to you, some of which you may already have heard. First, paragraph 115, you say, although the target number of machines was achieved, presumably you're talking about through the ventilator challenge and the other procurement routes, although that target number of machines was achieved, the quality of machines and their suitability for use in the NHS to treat COVID-19 or other conditions was variable.
That is evidently true.
There were also shortages of other items, including some medicines and consumable items. These limitations meant that clinicians were not always able to treat patients with their first choice of interventions.
That is also true.
That's important, is it? Or
it is, because familiarity is one of the... So human factors in healthcare is a significant thing. And you are less likely to make errors if you're using equipment and everything that you're familiar with. You're also less likely to make errors if you're not stressed. You are not overworked. You're not having to look after twice as many patients as usual, and so on and so forth. So clearly the circumstances of the pandemic meant that all of those things that on a normal day like today we would be able to deal with didn't happen. So all the human factors aspects of care were challenging.
next, this about in terms of the number and the allocation, to your paragraph 120, you're not aware of any specific incident where a patient who needed a ventilator was not able to access one. Is that still correct, to the best of your knowledge?
That is still correct.
You do go on to say, however, you make a further observation, don't you? You can't be sure that individual decisions weren't affected by this, the aspect of what was available. Can you just explain what you mean by that?
Yes. Even on a normal day, capacity constraints in intensive care and quite possibly in other aspects of healthcare do affect decision-making. So, for example, you have in the morning 5 patients who have been reviewed by an anaesthetist and a surgeon before coming in for surgery, and it's been considered that they should go to intensive care after their operation for the benefit of their outcome. But you've only got 2 intensive care beds available. So then the clinicians on the day have to make a decision about what to do, which 2 patients to put into those beds, and what to do with the other 3. Do we cancel their procedure, or do we proceed and send them to the normal ward? So that's an example of where capacity affects decision-making on a day-to-day basis. Now, you take the specific circumstances of the pandemic, and it is possible that anticipated pressure or real pressure may have changed subtly the way that clinicians thought about whether or not to send patients to intensive care or escalate their care. And we have heard in Module 3 from a survey that the experience of clinicians was that escalation decisions varied according to the demand in the system.
And finally, this, in terms of your reflections, you talk about the efforts made by colleagues across the HSC, Cabinet Office and NHS England as being remarkable and effective in many ways. But you say this at 187, I do not consider there was a robust system in place to ensure an adequate supply of key healthcare equipment and supplies to the NHS. What's the basis for your observation there?
I think that Mr. Sterling, Dame Emily and others set up systems and processes rapidly that were as effective as they could be in the circumstances. But at the risk of being boring, we were not well prepared. And ideally, we shouldn't have had to have stood those systems up in haste at the end of February or the beginning of March 2020. We would have had a plan that could have been executed earlier.
I want to turn now to what you say are the lessons to learn. This is your paragraph 200. Could you just talk us through some of the key aspects, starting with paragraph A about stockpiles?
So, there are some items that it's relatively straightforward to stockpile. PPE, some consumable items. Ventilators and other capital equipment is a much more difficult proposition for multiple reasons. The first is that they're bulky, big items, so they take up a lot of space, so storage is challenging. Second, they actually don't stay in the box, and you can't keep it in the box and then 10 years later open it and expect it to work properly. Some of the components of ventilators, oxygen sensors and so on have a life expectancy, and so if they're not used, they won't work. And then the third is that familiarity aspect. Ideally, these sorts of equipment should be being used in clinical practice so that the clinicians are familiar with them and we reduce the human factors risks. That said, we could do more to have at least a bit of a buffer in terms of stockpiling and supply. The most obvious way to do that is actually just to expand critical care capacity. I said at the beginning, we have fewer critical care beds per head of population than comparable countries. If we increase that, we would use it because we would send more patients to critical care after their operations, for example. And we would then have a bigger sort of buffer in the event of a pandemic surge or another emergency. We could also have reserve stocks in hospitals that were stored and rotated through the system at a regular basis. There's a challenge because one of the things in almost every hospital that is always at a premium is storage space. But it is surely, if we were able to do things like the ventilator challenge, then we should be able to do things like work the storage space out. So I think that we can do more. I think today, because I looked at the numbers this morning, we have 4,000 critical care beds available. We have about an 80% occupancy of those beds. And we have another 800 beds that we could open in the event of a surge, an unexpected surge. We could do a bit more than that and build a bit more of a buffer, I think.
Thank you. You talk about this, you say an unhelpful narrative developed in the press and disagreement between professionals and professional bodies which focused on the quality and quantity of ventilators and other items which were procured or manufactured to meet surge demands. This could be avoided through better preparation and advanced planning and agreement on the potential risks and benefits of different approaches with all relevant stakeholders, including the general public. What do you mean by disagreement between professionals and professional bodies? How widespread was that and how deep? What was that?
So there were disagreements in discussions which related back to that point I made earlier about a bad ventilator being worse than a no ventilator at all, that kind of notion. And some of that then spilled into the press, and that was pretty challenging, actually, given the efforts that we were making simply to even just save one life by having an additional machine that could fulfill a basic purpose. So, but I do understand why colleagues felt that way, because that's the way that we've all been trained. And this was an extraordinary situation that none of us were ready for. So the future lesson is be ready. Have these conversations in peacetime, not when we're all rapidly trying to change the way that we work in anticipation of these huge surges in demand.
I've asked you about your suggestion for a panel of experts, including engineers and clinicians. You go on in that paragraph to talk about a number of other factors, regulators, hibernating contract. Do you want to pick out any of those that you think are relevant to this?
Yes. So, so we know that one of the great successes of the pandemic effort in this country was the research, was the recovery trial, was the ISARIC study, which studied the epidemiology of COVID and so on. Part of the reason why those endeavours were so successful was because there were, in the case of the ISARIC study and REMAP-CAP, which was an intensive care study, the protocols for the research were already written. So when the researchers got wind of the fact that the pandemic was coming, they just activated those. The regulators were ready, and the processes that would normally take 6 months took 6 days, for example. So if we tried to adopt a similar approach with this, then we might be better prepared in the future. We could model different scenarios. So we could look at the scenario that faced us in sort of 15th, 16th of March 2020, where we thought we might need 30,000 ventilators within 2 to 3 weeks. And then you could also model a different scenario where you only needed 5,000 ventilators in 6 weeks, and so on and so forth. And then you develop both the specification that meets professional and, importantly, patient and public approval. And then you take that to the regulator and you say, OK, so this is what we think we need to do. What's the process going to be for getting this approved? Get the regulatory approval in advance, and then the whole process can get going quicker. And then all of the work that Sir Gareth and others did, approaching manufacturers, finding all the bits to go in the ventilator, that can all be done in advance. You could potentially plan to pivot industry from what it was normally doing, building Formula One cars or whatever, over to this, if anticipated. So all that this is talking about really is taking a more considered, measured, long-term approach to the challenge that we faced and doing it over years rather than days.
And just finally, please, your paragraph 202, the lack of manufacturing capability for medical devices, consumables and medicines was a key limitation of your response, in your view.
Yes.
What do you say should be done to look forward to that?
So, for example, one of the things that we that we ran short of in the first wave was the fluids that are required to support kidney failure. So in intensive care, we use a type of dialysis called hemofiltration. I don't want to get too technical, but essentially you wash the patient's blood and you replace electrolytes, so potassium and sodium and so on. Now, to do that, you need various bits of kit, but the most essential is just big bags of clean fluid with some potassium and some sodium and so on. This is not a difficult thing to make, but we didn't have that capability in the UK. And as a result of that, and the supply pressures from the two manufacturers that make those fluids that service UK critical care, our clinicians were required to adopt completely different practice to how they managed kidney failure in intensive care. They changed even down to using something called peritoneal dialysis, which is a way of providing support to kidney failure patients at home, which I don't think we'd ever used in intensive care before. But again, the ingenuity of my colleagues, they adapted and they did it. But that was a really good example of something that actually I couldn't quite understand why we couldn't do it ourselves. We couldn't manufacture the fluids ourselves. Ventilators are right the other end of the spectrum in terms of complexity. In fact, the two manufacturers that won, if you like, the ventilator challenge were Penlon, who make anaesthetic machines based in the UK, and Smiths Medical, who also have a factory in the UK, and they make transport ventilators. So we had that capability that was adapted to the ventilator challenge, but we didn't have any intensive care ventilation ventilator makers in the UK. So that's a limitation.
Having said finally, I hope my lady will permit me a finally, but it's, briefly, if you will, just looking at the time, clinician choice max, as Mr. Sterling said it. Given that you're here, can you give us the clinical perspective from where you are on that particular aspect of the debate?
I can see it from every angle. So Lord Carter did a review in 2015 of the unwarranted, what he perceived to be the unwarranted variation in procurement. He looked at orthopaedic surgery and the huge variation there was in the types of prosthetics that were used to replace a hip between different trusts and hospitals, and the huge variation in price. And from that came the Getting It Right First Time initiative, which is about trying to rationalise that huge variation, initially in procurement, but it's moved into other things as well. So too much variation or too much choice max is probably undesirable, both from a cost perspective, but more importantly from a safety perspective, because I've been in the same place for 15 years or something, but our residents rotate, our nurses will increasingly rotate. And so if they rotate through different places and they have to get used to different equipment, then there's clearly a safety challenge there. The flip side of that is the scenario that I just described with the renal replacement therapy fluids, because there's two manufacturers that make those, all the kit associated with renal replacement therapy and intensive care. And because of the international demand for those, we ran out, or we were close to running out, and we had to modify our practice. So Mr. Sterling had a sliding scale like this morning, and he said, we're over here in terms of choice max. So I'd like to be somewhere a bit closer to the middle. And I think that what's required is giving the clinical choice, but in a sort of more organised way. So get clinicians together to make decisions across different institutions. There may be, I'm not a procurement expert, there may be some financial benefit to that as well. And I would anticipate that there would be a patient safety benefit.
Thank you, Lady. Those are my questions. There are some...
Thank you. Just a few more questions for you, Professor. Ms Morris, who's sitting there.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Professor. I ask questions on behalf of the COVID bereaved Families for Justice. And my first topic is going to be about the impact of the procurement problems as you described them overall. And I think you're likely to agree with me about this, but if I can just take you to a couple of paragraphs from your statement. You said at paragraph 171 of your statement that the outcome of procurement of equipment and supplies wasn't sufficient to enable healthcare workers to meet the same standards of care to patients treated during the surges of the COVID-19 demand compared to non-surge or pre-pandemic times. You'd agree with that?
I would.
You said that patients were treated with equipment or medicines which were either not designed for that purpose or didn't provide best practice and were treated by staff who were not necessarily fully trained to do so. Again, would you agree with that?
I would. So on equipment, that was, for example, the repurposing of anaesthetic machines or transport ventilators to treat critically ill patients. In the case of medicines, that was, you mentioned propofol earlier, so that was in short supply, and so we had to moderate. And the staff, critically, and my colleagues worked under unbelievable pressure. And we had to bring in people that were not used to working in intensive care to support the intensive care effort. And it was extremely hard for them. And you've heard other testimony across the modules on that.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for those examples. You said that these risks would have been cumulative and would potentially have had an impact on patient safety.
Yes.
Thank you. Would you agree that this impact on patient safety was created to a large extent by the lack of proper planning, the lack of preparedness and the lack of procurement and supplies ahead of the pandemic?
I think that better planning and preparedness could have avoided at least some of the challenges that we had. If we had, for example, the surgeon ventilator demand, if that could have been met with equipment that people were more familiar with, then yes, that would have helped.
Thank you. I'm going to touch on familiarity again in a moment, because at paragraph 173, you exhibited a coroner's prevention of future death reports.
Yes.
From the East London coroner in relation to two gentlemen, Mr. Kishore Kumar Patel and Mr. Kofi Annan, who both died in April of 2021, in which the wrong filter was used with a breathing system and in their intensive care ventilator at the Nightingale Hospital. That coroner's report highlights that these two incidents were reported to be part of a cluster of incidents of a similar nature. And you'll recall from that report that there was a number of issues. There was the non-standardised colour coding of the filters, I think, different types of filters with different names, and sort of optional and variable positionings of the filters. And I think the coroner's words were it resulted in a very confusing situation. Is that an example you're giving there of where lack of availability of resources and demand in the first wave, clinicians were using unfamiliar or less than ideal equipment, medicines and consumables, as you say in your statement?
I think it's actually a broader point than even that. So these human factors, as I've said, are cumulative. There's the James Reason's Swiss cheese model of how these things line up and cause really big problems. With the filters, as an example, this is a problem across lots of different consumable items, medicines and so on, that things that do bits of kit that have vastly different or even slightly different purposes can look very similar. So we have that problem with medicines. So you can have a vial of two different drugs. One of them's basically water, and one of them is something that might stop you breathing. And if you're in a rush and you look at them, they've got the same colour on the bottle, and mistakes can happen. It's a similar example here with these filters, where one manufacturer makes a filter that does this, red, and the other one makes it green, and there's confusion. So this is a wider point than just COVID, pandemics, and so on. And it speaks a little bit to what Mr. Sterling said this morning about interoperability. We need some basic standards for all of the equipment that we use, and particularly the consumable items. That means that if you pick up something that's green, it always does the same thing.
Yes. So the broader point that applies in normal times, business as usual times, and then there's particular need, isn't there, in surge times, pandemic times, when the psychological burden, I think that both yourself and Mr. Sterling referred to, is even more acute on frontline workers who are maybe in that rush, and there's additional pressures to make those critical decisions. So you would agree that kind of lack of familiarity and those issues are even more acute in pandemic times?
Absolutely, and you have staff that are not normally working in those environments, working in them under supervision, but it's not ideal.
Thank you. And I think just to complete the thought, as it were, you say in paragraph 187 of your statement that these factors combined pose a potential risk to patient safety. And now, as kind of the interim director of patient safety for the NHS England, this is still your view.
It is.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Morris. Mr Thomas is over there.
Good afternoon, Professor. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
Okay. Professor, just a little bit of context. I represent FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. Your insights, Professor, into the procurement processes for ventilators and PPE during the pandemic are invaluable, especially given the challenges faced by ethnic minority healthcare workers in accessing suitable equipment. So the focus of my questions will be to understand how considerations of diversity, particularly concerning ethnic minorities, were integrated into the procurement process and design of these critical resources. So that's just to give you an indication as to where I'm going. So at paragraph 54 of your statement, you mention that the approach to procurement of ventilators had sufficient regard to equality and diversity, including the public sector equality duty, ensuring that different ventilators may be required for children and adults. You say this was factored into the procurement decisions.
Yes.
Could you elaborate, please, on how considerations for diversity, particularly concerning ethnic minority healthcare workers and patients, were integrated into the ventilator procurement process, please?
Thank you. Yes. So when it comes to the capital equipment like ventilators, non-invasive ventilation machines and so on, there are no differences between the types of machine that we would use in patients based on their ethnicity. There are differences in the types of machines that are suitable for patients of different weights predominantly and therefore age. So neonates, people up to 3.5 kilograms, there's a particular sort of category. Beyond that, from 3.5 kilograms basically up to any weight, most ventilators would be able to cope with, although some of the transport ventilators and the anaesthetic machine ventilators that we had to repurpose for use in critically ill patients would have been less able to cope with patients of a very heavy weight. There's a slightly different consideration in terms of some of the consumable items, particularly face masks, particularly the tight-fitting face masks that we use in patients requiring CPAP or non-invasive ventilation.
And we've heard a lot of evidence about that.
Yes, and so the main consideration is facial hair. And if you have facial hair, these masks do not fit as well. The mask fit is not brilliant for all patients all of the time, at any time. I don't know that that's got anything particularly to do with ethnicity. I think it is, some patients have different facial features. A solution to that problem potentially is to use an alternative, what we call interface, to provide non-invasive ventilation and CPAP. So instead of a mask that fits tightly onto the face, you can use a helmet or a hood. And we tried to procure helmets and hoods at high volumes as well as masks. Apart from the facial hair and facial features aspect, actually some patients just prefer hoods and helmets because having a tight-fitting face mask on it can be really unpleasant. So we tried to procure a diversity of interfaces. What I don't know is whether the preferred interface would have been available for every patient every time.
Let me move on to my next question, which is what specific measures were taken to ensure that the considerations in relation to the public sector equality duty that you reference in your statement were upheld when making those procurement decisions?
So, as I say, I think with with the capital equipment, I don't think that patients of different ethnicities or indeed of other protected characteristics would have been advantaged or disadvantaged by particular devices in different ways. When it comes to healthcare workers themselves, we followed the approach that we do with normal procurement, which is that we try to deploy into the system either equipment that there's a degree of familiarity with, or provide training materials to support that. And so I think Mr. Sterling mentioned quite exhaustive work that we did on developing quick start guides, training videos, and all sorts of things to go out into the system to support staff to use these new bits of kit safely.
Okay. I think you've touched upon and answered my second question, so I'm going to move on to my third. You note the diversity of the NHS workforce and the need for PPE design to accommodate all protected characteristics, including ethnicity, as mentioned in, that's paragraph 177 of your statement. So, in relation to that, how were the diverse needs of the NHS and social care staff considered in procurement, in the design of PPE during the pandemic?
I am afraid I can't answer that question because PPE was not an area that I was involved in at all.
All right. I shall move on then. Just bear with me.
I think the rest are all PPE, aren't they, Mr. Thomas?
I think, yeah. Milady, you're right. If you can't help assist on that, those are all my questions. Thank you, Milady.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Those are all the questions we have for you, Professor. Thank you so much for all that you did during the pandemic to try and assist your patients, your colleagues' patients, and thank you also to your husband.
Thank you.
Who obviously stepped up when he was asked to, or maybe you insisted he did. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stote. I shall return 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.